When you think of the mech fantasy, you probably think about the outrageous pieces of hardware that you get to toy around with. So, if you've never played Armored Core and I told you half of it looks like this, and that this is arguably the more exciting half of the game, I'd understand if you had some questions. It seems counterintuitive, but the integration of less exciting elements can beef up a work by creating a very clear context for the exciting parts. Piloting a mech is a cool activity on its own, but if you frame it within a gig economy of a gone wrong cyberpunk world, the novelty develops a very understandable and very real emotion. If you cast your mind back in 1997, and you think of a mech game, you might not immediately have thought about something with a presentation like Armored Core, and if you'd have just looked at the box art, you might not predict the type of mech fantasy which lies ahead. But the immaculate design and the immersive presentation forbade anything that hit not as hard as Armored Core 1 does. Historical context is always valuable when discussing older games, but it's often a crutch to sneak around talking about a game's shortcomings. You can launder in some preemptive diffusions of potential criticisms by pointing out how a game made prior to the standardization of certain presentation techniques was constrained by processing limitations. Here, however, you don't really need to bring it up. Boot it up today and Armored Core just holds up. Which is weird, because fast-paced third-person 3D action games aren't exactly the easiest genre to go back to. What might have pushed Armored Core over the edge here was how long this game had been marinating within the studio. The Kingsfield franchise was FromSoftware's first foray into video games, but their original idea had actually been to make a game where the player pilots small robots in tunnels. That's basically the Armored Core experience, minus the small robots. But that's not the extent to which Kingsfield's shadow looms over Armored Core. If you look at the most fondly remembered action and action-adjacent games of 1997, you see a trend in their presentation of action, and this applies to the whole early days of 3D polygon action games as well. Games like GoldenEye 64 took advantage of the industry's experimentations with first-person shooters and leaned into lessons learned to deliver on the action. Games like Final Fantasy VII and Fallout stayed true to the old RPG mantra of abstracting the combat in some way. Symphony of the Night tackled the 3D paradigm by jettisoning a whole dimension, save for some animation effects. Star Fox 64 also jettisoned the third dimension by locking the player on a rail. Games like Resident Evil leaned into the unfriendly third dimension to make a combat system fueled by anxiety and a desire to avoid confrontations. The seminal platformer of the fifth generation, Super Mario 64, had launched in the previous year and set the foundation for snappy and intuitive navigation in 3D. But in 1997, there was still no consensus on how to integrate navigating in 3D space and action in 3D space. That's the landscape Armored Core is brought into, and the decisions it makes will trickle down to subsequent titles and make for a series with a wholly unique and untainted philosophy for how to approach this sort of game. Subsequent games made controls a lot more user-friendly, and I quite like how in later games combat is so fast that it's like you're piloting fighter jets, zooming past each other at high speeds, but the approach here is quite nice as well. As a contained activity, I should note, if all you want is an old mech game which holds up, you can't do much better than Armored Core. But if you want your combat to be in service of some larger ambition, if you need to have the themes being presented to evaluate the presentation, Armored Core also delivers. Like I said when I talked about Shadow Tower Abyss, FromSoft has a real hands-off mentality when it comes to the players experiencing the story. They seem to, and this predates Miyazaki by the way, they seem to design their games with the narrative being something you need to work for if it matters to you, and they aren't seemingly all that interested in whether or not you do. Of course, there's more to be gained by engaging. This game takes place in the somewhat distant future after the Earth has been made nearly uninhabitable by a massive war referred to as the Great Destruction. The surface of the planet is completely inhospitable, and so humanity has had to burrow into the ground and construct subterranean cities. In these cities, two corporations have amassed an unmatched degree of power and dominate every function of the world. Those corporations being Chrome and Murakumo Millennium. They exist as bitter rivals, constantly waging war and sabotage against one another. And this battle has created a lucrative mercenary economy for Armored Core pilots. These Ravens exist as an extension of the battle between the two corporations, but they are inherently aligned with neither. They take the side of the highest bidder for however long they are the highest bidder. This is presented in-game with the mission select screen. As we complete missions, we unlock new ones. Nothing revolutionary here. And the mission briefs and the emails we get are where the bulk of the contextualization for the in-mission storytelling takes place. And they don't exactly spoon-feed you what's going on. And if you get lost in the mech customization, you might miss your complicity in the events around you. The early game has us accept missions from Chrome and from the Murokuma Millennium corporations, and without being told, we are changing a hidden value which tracks which of these corporations is actually winning. Then, near the endgame, the company we side with more often will overtake the other and branch the in-game narrative. When you're replaying the game and you choose different missions and all of a sudden the endgame looks completely different and the actual missions you're unlocking are completely different from last time around, that's a very pleasant shock. They kinda spoil it by letting you play through the missions you didn't get in your run after you complete the game, but still, very cool. Once you know about this, if you haven't been at that point, you might also want to begin taking note of what's going on in those mission briefs and emails you kept skipping to get to the action, because there's actually a lot happening behind the scenes. In broad strokes, the core idea we are looking at when we play Armored Core is the same idea we were looking at when we played Dark Souls. Remember in Dark Souls 1 how Gwyn's corrupting of the natural order of the world was manifesting horrors and how the systems we interacted with as players were reinforcing the lie he imposed, and how the narrative unfolded as a natural expression of play. Yeah, guess what Armored Core does as well? We are a soulless mercenary with no greater ambition than to climb the leaderboards, build a stronger mech, and get paid. And to gamify that awful life, to make you roleplay it, we climb a leaderboard, build a better mech, and get paid. On the storytelling front, there's a really beautiful synthesis of the horrific pre-apocalyptic Earth narrative and the mechanics we interact with that world through, and how the former is a natural expression of the latter is something to behold. Something FromSoft does a lot in their games, have ever since Kingsfield and do to this day, is to layer the narrative of the world such that the events which created the world you inhabit have some residual elements lingering about for you to engage with. In Armored Core, we get hints to the old world when we accept missions which have us explore for the pre-war weapons and technologies. The best fight in the game has us contend with a gigantic super mech from the old world, which is accidentally reawakened on the surface. And of course, there's Human Plus. In being a game about robots in tunnels, Armored Core was the realization of a conceptual ambition which predated Kingsfield. In the pre-war technology running around its world and the hands-off approach to storytelling, Armored Core is a lineal descendant of Kingsfield in that the principles governing the presentations are adjusted for a new setting, but still true in spirit and in kind to what came before. Kingsfield's shadow looms large over Armored Core, not just for these reasons though. It doesn't look it, but the games are also running on the same engine, and outside of the scripted functions for the right-hand face buttons, they are using the same control scheme. Nothing quite like using L2 to look up and moving forwards and backwards with the D-pad, but left and right with R1 and L1. If you watch my Kingsfield videos, or if you've played those games yourself, you'll know that those games are incredibly clunky and tanky for first-person fantasy games. Like I said in my Kingsfield 1 video, you can turn on the spot and all that, but when you're playing, you're not gonna do that. You're going to be predicting where you'll need to face a new direction, and you'll start doing so a bit before the turn to save time, and because of this, in a way, John Alfred Forster moves a lot less like a nimble knight and a lot more like a car. But that's the cool thing. Armored Core is all about controlling tanky, clunky machines, so this control setup actually makes a lot of sense here. If you go back to the game now, you might need a few minutes to get accustomed to the button mapping, but once you're in it, and you begin to appreciate the depth offered. There is a real feeling of mastering the mech controls which comes after a few hours of play, which feels very much in tandem with the mech fantasy. The key thing separating a newbie from a pro is the game's use of momentum, probably. If you're stationary, you have to actually build it up, and it takes a bit to do that. Getting good at the game is learning to simulate on the spot how much momentum your next move requires and making those adjustments in real time to meet your intended path. In Kingsfield, you start turning the camera a full 10 seconds prior to making a turn because that's how long turning the camera takes. In Armored Core, you stand stationary for 10 seconds to plan a tall flight to a platform because that's how long it takes to line up a good flight. Mobility is limited, and your skill in the pilot seat is the determining factor in your success. I can't stress enough how cool this is. The impulse when you're designing a game like this is to make the mechs control like snappy anime characters. But the mech fantasy is not about being a mech, so that's not the element which is being gamified here. You're not playing as a robot, you're playing as a pilot. The core experience here, the gameplay loop, if you will, has us complete missions to gain funds and to gain new mech parts, which we then use to upgrade our mechs. The key driving force of the game is the customization of your mech, and every action you perform feeds into this task. There's a lot of customization available and a lot of variation and variables to toy around with if you really want to min-max this thing. Different mech builds empower different strategies, and once you get sucked into the mech customizing game, you might find yourself forgetting that there's something fundamentally wrong with accepting the missions you're accepting. It's a really addicting system, and there's a surprising amount of variation on how to build up your mech to best suit your preferred mode of engagement. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's often the case that the best way to see the sentiment which developers intended to express is to look at how they open their games. This is where they set the tone, the expectations, and where they drill in the fundamentals you'll be expected to use to navigate the landscape of the work in question. Armored Core 1 starts with us naming our character, and then we're dumped into a tutorial framed as an entry exam into the Ravens. After the combat tutorial, we have access to the Raven's Nest. It's a selection menu, where we can access the shop, the garage, the leaderboards, the emails where we can save, and where we select our missions. Armored Core is quite deceptive about its brand of mech fantasy, because although it really pushes the badass mech combat angle, see the main menu cinematic, this selection menu is where the real meat of the role-playing and mech fantasy is. It doesn't have as much individualization or hyper-specificity as, say, the old Rainbow Six games had, but it leans into the same pacing structure where the pre-mission preparations account for at least half of your experience. Shopping around for mech parts, optimizing and personalizing your mech, choosing where to ally yourself, etc. Armored Core's brand of mech fantasy doesn't end in the cockpit. The way the world design is baked into the experience is that players are made to interact with the forces that drive this universe to be what it is. It starts innocently enough with us going over some emails and accepting some missions, but by the end of the game, we'll be questioning how we could let the thing blindside us the way it does. When we're in the missions themselves and are not dealing with the mid-mission betrayals or revolutions, which have a tendency of robbing us of our payday, by the way, we're face to face with some of the most blocky level design the PlayStation 1 was ever asked to display. Levels are sizable enough to accommodate the mechs, especially important since the fine-tuning of movement becomes non-existent during high speeds. The threats incorporated into the levels also have some variety to keep you from going on autopilot in internalizing and navigating the world. That the levels are as blocky as they are is obviously a hardware constraint, but since this is a cyberpunk gone wrong universe, having to be blocky makes the world look very manufactured. Like every component of it was mass-printed in some factory with no space for artistic expression, which is very true to the cyberpunk aesthetic. I don't know if this was ever thought about during development, but I think it's a really interesting statement on the world of Armored Core that the only thing which doesn't have this mass-manufactured feel, the only thing wherein artistic sentiment and individualism can be expressed is in the designs of the mechs, the war machines. Did I mention that you can just doodle whatever you want and have the game wrap your painting as an added texture on the mech? Also, did I mention that they were designed in real life by one of the guys who made Optimus Prime? Anyways, another thing that might not have been a deliberate design decision, and this is one I can imagine many players never thinking about that much, is the absence of details. And again, I think this can be rationalized. Because of the scale of our mechs, the small details which would be there in the environments get glossed over when you're looking around because the camera is zoomed out so far to accommodate a gigantic mech fighting other gigantic mechs. The approach to combat is the same as the approach to the world building and the mech navigation, in that what is being simulated is not a mech, but a mech pilot. Being successful in the firefights is less about nimble fingers and fast reactions, and more about knowing how to maneuver the auto-aim more efficiently. Both you and the AI are controlling pilots, not mechs, and combat feels appropriately delayed. Delayed, but not slow. It's actually kind of wild how much mobility and how varied the combat options are and how fast things move without the game being broken, considering the caveman control layout of the original PlayStation 1 controller. On the strategy side, the mech customization and optimization also ask us to factor in what kind of approach to missions we'll be using when we decide on purchases. There's a lot of strategies we can employ to complete a given task, and once we know what playstyle we're comfortable with, that, more than anything else, will direct how we evaluate what counts as a good use of our funds when it comes time for making purchases. My playthroughs usually start with me selling off all my guns and buying a laser gun. This is because we are on the hook for our ammo and repairs, but laser weapons charge themselves, so I save money like this, which I then use for things like high capacity energy storage, faster recharge rates, lighter, less energy demanding mech parts, etc. And of course, the optimizations for our mechs will naturally advantage us in some missions and not in others. The missions on offer here are quite varied, with many of them embracing my favorite approach to crafting challenges, asking players to overcome limitations. I've talked about this on the channel before, but simple alterations to the core control scheme or the introduction of a new kind of obstacle is often enough to make a level or challenge compelling. Imagine a Mario level where you can only jump 5 times, and you're imagining a challenge which asks the player to approach a familiar game with a different aim, which optimizes the best approach to be something which looks quite different from the standard one and allows different mechanics to shine than the ones you're used to interact with. In the case of Armored Core, in addition to the standard defeat all the enemies in this place challenges, we have levels with poisonous corrosive gas, levels where we're clearing out an insect infestation, defending some object, etc. They add a lot of variety by asking us to optimize our approach differently. As for the standard challenges, this approach to variety is incorporated there as well. We have levels which are effectively platforming challenges. We have levels which are very compact, where falling is almost an instant failure. You get the idea. And you are directed through the levels with money because, as I already noted, you are on the hook for your ammo and your repairs. So if you don't take the combat seriously, if you don't haste through the corrosive gas missions, if you don't line up your shots properly, expect to see a bigger bill during your payday. If your mech is destroyed, that always counts as a loss, and failing at any of the variety challenges, say the truck you're defending is destroyed, you also fail. And if you fail, you don't get paid. It's really fun to contrast the utilization of the in-game economy for player direction and storytelling in Armored Core compared to Kingsfield, because here we're watching a masterclass in how to make use of every facet of this thing, whereas Kingsfield's economy was very clumsily and seemingly arbitrarily implemented. It seems obvious to us that the cost of an item should have some correlation to its utility, but Kingsfield had other ideas. Armored Core not only manages to cross this obvious hurdle, the game integrates the economy into the core gameplay loop so well that it's even used for role-playing. Note that our missions include attacking environmental groups, breaking up protests, and sabotaging research experiments. And you do these things so that you can perpetuate the system which makes it possible for you to do these things. Is this the deepest story in the world? No. But the game knows how to milk its presentation for max expressive value, which I find more interesting than the story being presented. Armored Core gets a lot of mileage out of every little mechanic, like the leaderboards. On paper, this is a really strange inclusion, right? Why is the player being pitted up against AI characters? Is it to make the player more competitive? And get into the role-playing of a cyberpunk mech pilot? Sure, but it actually goes deeper. The way the player is made complicit in the horrible system which runs the world of Armored Core is by simply locking progress behind continuing the rat race, and by layering the narrative dispensers, the mission briefs and emails, with a healthy coating of PR. The first mission of the game has us clear out terrorists from a factory. That is literally how the game spells it out for us, but do some digging, and lo, the terrorists are actually the people who worked in the factory, and they were protesting being laid off by occupying the building. The player is not some mech hero in this game, they're the muscle for faceless and soulless mecha corporations. And I get that this is the most overused and pretentious twist in games writing, but I think in Armored Core's case, it warrants celebrating, not only because this game came out before Metal Gear Solid popularized the anti-war war genre of video game storytelling, but also because the game doesn't rub it in the player's face. They need to dig for what's really going on for themselves, and the weird side tangents into the pre-destruction history of the world and the cool hidden unlockables like the Moonlight Greatsword do a really good job of enticing players to actually do that digging and see what it is that's corrupting this world. This idea of the natural world being corrupted and the player being confronted with the horrors which manifest from the twisting of the natural world is a FromSoft staple to this day. I zoomed over this earlier in this video, but Dark Souls is a great comparison case, and I'm not just saying that to shill my Dark Souls videos, hint hint. In that game, we left the Undead Asylum and eventually met up with Frampt, who told us about linking the fire, and that game's story and its systems were all deliberately tuned to present that ideal as something to desire, when in reality we were being tricked into perpetuating a horrific system which rotted the world. Armored Core does that too. You start the game, input your name, rev up your engine, and try not to be lame. Oh yeah. You clear out the terrorists, make mama proud. Everyone in the back shout it out loud. That's enough fire for now. And like I just went over, those terrorists who've occupied the factory are actually laid off workers who are protesting. And the player needs to read between the lines to catch all that stuff. They need to actually connect the dots to the happenings in the board meetings taking place in the shadow of the game's plot, and they need to be cynical about exactly what it is they're doing in order to get the message. And I think that's a much stronger approach than the alternative, where the game stops and says, "No, you were the bad guy all along." Here, the player is asked to consider their own participation in the process, which has destroyed the world. Players may realize what's going on, but their character will continue his job, and if you think I'm reaching in celebrating the understated and implied narrative framing here, let's talk about that incredible video game storytelling moment I hinted at earlier. Let's talk about Human Plus. I already noted that the first thing you do in a well-made game is usually the stuff which developers really thought was important, because that's what frames the entire experience. And I noted that the first thing we do in Armored Core is to name our character. But actually, if you play the game and decide to check out the mail, you'll see that they didn't personalize each and every email with the name you gave them at the start. Funny that. The mission sorties also don't throw your name around to make it feel like you're really in the game. Where the name is relevant is in the rankings, the leaderboards, where you can compare your status next to a bunch of NPC ravens. The best reason I can figure for us naming our character is to personalize the experience, not because they intended on us being addressed, but because they were setting up for Human Plus. If the player keeps up to date on the happenings in their mission briefs, they'll find that there's a faction very interested in recovering pre-war technology. The gigantic war machine mech I talked about earlier is one of those techs, as is the gigantic space laser which caused the Great Destruction. Another one is something called Human Plus. Players can go through the whole game without ever noticing the phrase because it's really in the periphery of the game at all times, but if they follow up on it, they'll eventually be asked to dispose of mechs whose reaction timing is far above anything found in any opponent elsewhere in the game. That's Human Plus. It's an attempt from the old world to merge man and machine, which is being repurposed in the present to create better fighters. This is such a small and tucked away little bit of world building, and you need to seriously milk the entire interface to piece this story together. I love this, and I love what comes next. In the main menu leaderboard, the way it works is that the better we score, the higher we rank. At first glance, this just seems like a way of encouraging the players to accept the soul-crushing missions and continue to operate within this horrible incentive-structured world, but even this menu is utilized in the Human Plus subplot. When they deliver on the most brutal failure state I've ever seen. Players do missions to get money. If they spend a lot of ammo in the missions, they'll need to pay for that. If they take a lot of damage, they need to pay for that. Sometimes they'll do a mission and won't be able to turn a profit. And if the player does this a few times in a row, they can get into a very vicious cycle of not being upgraded enough to tackle the missions on hand, but being too poor to afford new upgrades. In that case, they'll be forced to sell off some of their mech parts, making them even less equipped for future encounters. The game forces players to go into debt to keep their mech prepared and ammoed up before the start of each mission. But once their credit score goes into the negatives, they won't be able to buy anything. This cycle is eventually broken with a strange cutscene where the player is brought to where the final boss rests, with talk in the background about the player being a raven who came here through the usual route, after which the game restarts. You see what just happened, right? The company sold the player's body for medical research to pay for their debts. They put the player into the Human Plus program. This is the game's idea of an easier difficulty, in case the players are having too hard of a time. Once the game is restarted, the player will have their old mech, and they'll get an upgrade to make the game easier, like energy weapons costing less to use, back weapons being usable without having to kneel, and the ability to use overweight mechs. Those upgrades are basically the game's way of telling the player that the run is screwed beyond fixing. In addition to having to replay the old missions, there's a final punishment which is the darkest thing in the game, even though you can easily miss it. Go into the rankings, and behold, our mech's associated pilot name is now the word Rebel, followed by a 3-digit number, because after being sold into medical research, our character ceased to exist. The very first thing we did in our playthrough was to name our character, not because our name will be used a lot, but because it's the first and most personal touch you make on your run, aside from arguably your mech build. And the game takes this away from you if you play suboptimally to highlight the cruel and depersonalized nature of the world. And the coolest thing about this is that you can completely miss it, because the game isn't hard enough that you'll be losing a lot of missions. And even if this happens, because the game doesn't spoon-feed the player its narrative, they might not actually put one and one together and understand the horrible thing that just happened. So, after having their existence erased, they might just go on ahead, continuing their participation in the mech mercenary economy. The final mission is another wonderful example of the game playing with the framing devices of its own narrative. We are brought in to clear out some mines, but get ambushed because the higher-ups have decided that we may no longer exist. So we weave our way through the level to confront the higher-ups and eventually come face to face with none other than Nineball, the best raven in the world, according to the in-game leaderboards. It's not a mandatory fight, we can just zoom past him if we want to, but like every other instance of anything else in this game, if we choose to engage, we can strip another layer of deception from the world and uncover what's actually going on. Because we don't actually just fight Nineball in this level, we fight him twice. If we dash past him the first time, this seems perfectly acceptable. But if we destroy him in the first confrontation, we'll probably start wondering what the deal is. See, Nineball is not actually real, it's a computer. Armored Core takes place in a world whose operating processes lack any semblance of morality. A world wherein no one is actually in charge of anything. The whole operation is just an extended and unquestioned process which chugs along in spite of the suffering it inflicts on everyone who lives within this system. And how fitting it is that the final reveal is the reveal that it is. The whole world is controlled by this morally empty process running operation because the whole world is controlled by a computer. And what is a computer if not a morally empty process running operation? Armored Core asks a lot of questions and challenges some basic assumptions about its genre. It's not the first anti-war mech story, not by a long shot, but it gamified its methods before Metal Gear Solid came out with the fighting game about avoiding conflict. It's not the first third-person action game, but it's from that same generation, and it was already forwards-thinking enough to gamify the pilot of the mech instead of the mech itself. It might be that the clunkiness was actually a failed attempt at doing the more anime-inspired motions, but even if that's the case, I think what we got is better than that would have been, at least in 1997. And that's probably the coolest thing about Armored Core. It got all of this right before getting this right was taken for granted. And because it couldn't lean into design conventions quite like games can now, it had to think outside the box. I've spent a lot more time detailing the esoteric and strange narrative dispensers for this game than I do in most of my videos, because so much of my appreciation of Armored Core was interacting with all the separate menus and piecing the whole story together. Having played the subsequent Armored Core games, I know that things don't get much better for humanity, but I think the final reveal here, that the world is evil because its governing processes are being administered by a computer, is actually rather hopeful. We use a machine to confront the machine and learn in the end that the solution to the evils of this world might be as simple as humanity deciding to accept the responsibility for making a better world themselves and maintaining it, instead of handing the power off to a process. I mean, we're gonna talk about Armored Core 2 eventually, so I can just say that things don't get much better, at least for the inhabitants of this game's world. For us, the player, Armored Core 2 will be a massive upgrade in almost every way, but that's a video for another day. While you wait for that one, if you haven't already, consider checking out some of the other breakdowns I've made on FromSoftware's old library. I covered all 4 mainline Kingsfield games as well as both of the Shadow Towers. You might also be interested in checking out that chat I had with Sophie Pilbeam about Armored Core prior to completing the game for the first time. And you might want to see my video on interfaces, where Armored Core is brought up more than a little. All of these links are available in the description box below. Don't click away from this video just yet though. When it's ready, the early look at the Armored Core 2 video will be available on patreon.com/medievalmegaman, where I usually dump things a few weeks ahead of the release here. It's really the best way to support the channel. Videos like this one take a lot of time to put together, and any support you can give is massively appreciated, even if it's just liking the video and subscribing. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video.